Hello and welcome as we embark now on a journey to a very special place in Greece, a spot called Mycenae, that was 3,000 years ago the very first capital of a united Greece, and after its fall remained the only such capital of a united Greece until the 1820s. Mycenae was the citadel made famous by Homer in his poem The Iliad as the headquarters of the high king Agamemnon, that great monarch who had called together all the Greeks from their different palaces at Pylos, where Nestor ruled, Ithaca with Odysseus, Tiryns near Mycenae with Diomedes, Athens with the Athenian king Menestheus, all these other kings, 1,200 ships, thousands of men, for an expedition across the Aegean Sea to Troy, to take the city of Troy and bring back to Greece the captured queen of King Menelaus of Sparta, who was the brother of Agamemnon of Mycenae. Not a single soul lives at Mycenae today. It's abandoned to the eagles and to tourists and archaeologists. And yet there is a spirit about that place like no other in Greece, indeed for me, like no other in the world. Homer described it as strong-walled and rich in gold, and archaeological discoveries since the 19th century has proved how right he was on both counts. So prepare to be dazzled as we get into our vehicle, leave the Argive plain behind us, and head up the curving road around a shoulder of a great hill until Mycenae comes into view. The first glimpse of the citadel is breathtaking. The stone ruins crouch atop a rounded mass of rock like a mountain lion in its lair, glaring down at you, expressing power, ferocity, majesty. All of these qualities of the dynasties of warrior kings who ruled from this citadel. Mycenae was set in a very strategic place. The ancient road that ran from the plain of Argos, where the fabulous seaside city of Nafplio is also today, and an arm of the sea that brings the Aegean very close to the heart of Greece. Roads from that plain ran across some hills and to the famous city of Corinth, north beyond them, which was the city that commanded both the Corinthian Gulf and the Saronic Gulf, and whose ships could go in either direction. So anybody who controlled this pass controlled much of the most important travel and trade in ancient Greece. It was also a spot that had natural sources of water. There was a tradition that the name came from mushroom, if you are aware that MYCO, as in mycology, is the study of mushrooms. That's from the Greek word for a mushroom. And it's there in the root of our place name, Mycenae, Mycenae, as the Greeks call it. The tradition was that the ancient hero Perseus, the slayer of the sea monster, the rescuer of the beautiful Ethiopian princess Andromeda, he came up here from Tiryns, his citadel down on the plain, looking for a high place, for a castle, a guarded spot up in the hills, and he picked up a mushroom from this rock, and beneath it he saw water flowing out of the rock. He knew this would be a good place to build. Archaeologists came to Mycenae at a time when it was a deserted, rocky mass of ruins in 1876, led by the charismatic German digger Heinrich Schliemann, who had come back to Greece as a national hero because he had found what he called Troy in Turkish territory, had smuggled out to Greece under the noses of the Ottoman custom guards the gold treasure of Priam, again as he called it, from Troy, brought it back to Greece. He married a young Greek wife called Sophia. This German multimillionaire had made himself as much as possible into a Greek. So he was given permission in 1876 to go to Mycenae and look for the other half of the Trojan War story. The epic of the Iliad, sung by Homer, is partly about the king and the princes of Troy, King Priam, his sons Hector and Paris, and the women of Troy, Hecuba, the queen, Helen of Troy, the adopted daughter-in-law, Andromache, the heroic wife of Hector. But facing this family trying to hang on to their home city, Troy, is this mass of Greeks led by Agamemnon. In the Odyssey, the sequel to the Iliad, Homer takes us to, up close and in person, Odysseus' palace in Ithaca, the island off the west coast of Greece, Nestor's palace at Pylos in the southwest Peloponnese, and Sparta to visit Menelaus and his restored wife, Helen. He never takes us to Mycenae. It's as if the center of the whole mystery of how did these Greeks manage to unify in such a brilliant burst of culture and energy and achievement to undertake this great expedition to Troy and bring down that mighty city. How did they do it? It was too dazzling for him to approach. Just as he doesn't show us the actual fall of Troy, he never takes us to Mycenae. So there was a lot of argument about what the site might have been really like, since it's not closely described in the Iliad. Schliemann went there in 1876, accompanied by Greek archaeologists. They were keeping an eye on him because, in spite of their hero status that they had accorded to him, they were suspicious of his excavation methods. The one thing that was still clearly visible in the citadel itself was the Lion Gate, something that we will see up close and in person right now. We're going to park our car or get out of our bus, walk from the car park toward the great citadel. We're going to get our ticket, walk up the curving path where so many thousands of visitors to Mycenae in the Bronze Age have gone before us, including probably diplomatic visitors from as far away as Egypt, certainly from Syria, maybe from Sicily, from up in the Balkans, all people drawn to this center of power. It's a long procession of ghosts. Let's join them. We won't be disappointed as we approach Mycenae. Many sites like the Athenian Agora, the ancient marketplace and civic center of Athens, have been so shattered that very little of their impressive structures remain for us today. Mycenae is not like that. And what is most impressive to us immediately is the fortifications. The lower circle of walls dates to very late in the site's history, to the late 1200s BC. These were erected after an earthquake had shaken down a lot of the building, but that didn't daunt the kings of Mycenae. They raised walls even more powerful and perfectly made than the earlier rings of walls higher up the slope had been. We are funneled into an area between two walls, which are suddenly running along beside our approach path, when suddenly we see in front of us, looming overhead, this gigantic edifice, the famous Lion Gate of Mycenae. It's named for a pair of lions, they are actually probably lionesses, who are standing in a triangular block of stone over the lintel of the door that leads into the citadel, the gate itself. They actually perform an architectural function. That triangle is part of the relieving arch. They are on a very thin, light stone slab, and you could tell from its smoothness and grayness it's different from the rest of the stone. And they sit on a gigantic lintel stone, which is almost the same size as the two side stones and the threshold stone of the gate. 4 stones, each one probably weighing something like 20 tons. There they stand, these two lions or lionesses, and what are they framing? A single column that tapers from top to bottom, contracting toward the bottom. This is the emblem of the old gods of Minoan Crete and of the Mycenaean religion, a religion centered around not an Olympian Zeus, like classical Greek religion later, but a mother goddess, a beneficent, all-giving, all-knowing female deity. And that column is probably her symbol. And the lionesses on either side, now missing their heads, those were probably carved of wood and covered with gold leaf, or perhaps carved of ivory or some other spectacular substance. Those lions are her symbols of power. She is a mistress of beasts. She is a mistress who tames wild nature. Pause for the inevitable photograph in the gate there under the Lion Gate. If you came alone, you're just going to have to ask some other tourist to take your picture, and I hope you will return the favor. It's a lovely gathering spot. As you see through the gate in the sunlight, the beginnings of the spectacular ruins beyond. Then go on through the Lion Gate and look inside at the bits and pieces of structure that show you how it worked. There are post holes in the lintel stone on either side of the wide square opening. These held the pivots on which the great wooden gates would have turned, and at about chest height on either side, maybe waist height, you will see the holes into which were socketed the mighty wooden bar, which held those gates shut every night when the citadel had shut down at the end of another long day. To your left as you walk in is a little hole in the wall leading back to a larger chamber. Opinion is divided among archaeologists as to whether this held a sort of image of a little guardian deity, or what I think, it was the gatekeeper's house, and probably his dog also, who slept there all night, just to be on hand if some enemy was heard outside the gates, or if there was some friend who knocked and needed to be admitted in the middle of the night. The gate is very much a serious area for defense. We've got staircases that run up on the inside of the gate, which gave soldiers from Mycenae, warriors of Mycenae, access to the walls above that entranceway that we have just come up. And this means that as we approach the gate, we are vulnerable to having stones and arrows showered down on us from above as we have the temerity to try to tackle this great citadel. Immediately, we are confronted by one of the most spectacular of all the elements in this citadel, this fortress of Mycenae, the shaft grave circle. We started with Schliemann coming here in 1876, seeing the Lion Gate. He naturally went just beyond it into the circle of ruins, began digging, and he came down in a cemetery. This was his main dig at Mycenae. This circle, this stone circle of walls enclosing a number of things called shaft graves. These are square shafts cut down into the earth and stone of the hilltop, down to a depth of almost 25 feet. And at the bottom of those shafts, Schliemann encountered the skeletons of 19 individual people, men, women, and children. A dynasty, a ruling dynasty without doubt of Mycenae, buried in these shaft graves. Just as we use gravestones in our cemeteries today, these kings and queens had had gravestones set over those shafts with images of war or of hunting or chariot racing to show their prowess, their power in this symbolic way. And they were buried with treasures. It's estimated that 30 pounds of solid gold could be assembled from all of the crowns, face masks, sword hilts, all the rest of the gold that had been buried with these kings and queens in their shaft graves. Truly, Homer's city rich in gold seemed to have leapt out of the earth. Schliemann was a great romantic, a great believer that Homer was history, not fable or myth. He published pictures of the masks, the gold face masks, which covered 5 of the men. They are probably kings. These may be death masks placed over them to preserve their features for eternity. And he thought, I'm looking at Agamemnon. There was one mask in particular that he really got excited by. It was a mask of a bearded individual who may or may not have originally had a mustache. The initial newspaper report said it didn't. But by the time it's made it to the world's newspapers and all those early photos in 1876 were circling the globe, this very masculine, very powerful looking mask, this face on a mask, had a nice Prussian mustache with a pair of upturned ends. They may have been added by a local goldsmith at Schliemann's request to make it look more like someone he really admired, the Kaiser of Germany. And in fact, the treasures from Troy had been sent up to the Kaiser of Germany, Schliemann's own national leader, he was a German, as an offering to that very powerful leader. At any rate, he looked at this mask and he said, this must be the face of Agamemnon. I am looking at the great hero who brought down Troy. Well, Schliemann was wrong. In this, as in so many other things, modern science and further excavations have shown that he was way off base. These gold masks, these shaft graves, belong to an earlier age of Mycenae's history than the time of the Trojan War. They carry us back to the Middle Bronze Age, anywhere from 1700 BC down to about 1500 BC or 1450. So we're way too early for Agamemnon and his family. This must relate to those earlier myths of the great hero Perseus, that slayer of the monster, that man who wedded Andromeda. The Perseid meteor showers each year are a reminiscence of Perseus. He's the man who killed the Gorgon and all those other heroic acts. His dynasty would account for the shaft graves. More shaft graves have been found outside the citadel now, some of which appear to certainly have queens in them, ladies covered with gold and gold ornaments. We know something about the Mycenaeans now from these skeletons. We can tell that average age seems to have been a little under 40, which isn't bad for the ancient world. Good teeth, good overall health, robust people, and from an analysis of the isotopes in the bones, we can tell something about their diet. They ate a lot of meat. And it's fascinating that the scenes that Homer gives us in both the Iliad and the Odyssey of that heroic world, when kings sit down to dine, it is meat and only meat, preferably beef, that they are eating all the time. The skeletons in the shaft graves support that view of these Bronze Age warrior kings. Let's leave the shaft graves behind, except to say one thing. They are surrounded by a very strange double wall of stone. It's my own belief that when the shaft graves were incorporated into the citadel with the building of that last wall in the 13th century BC, that lowest cyclopean or giant block wall which comes up to the Lion Gate, they represented a religious problem. I think they had to bring them into the circle of the citadel for security, but it is a very ancient tradition among the Greeks, obviously going back all the way to the Mycenaeans, that dead people don't live with living people. Dead people must be outside. They pollute, no matter how royal or how holy they might have been, they pollute living communities. They are dangerous in a spiritual way. I think the way of neutralizing them was to build not one circular wall, but two walls of upright stone slabs covered over with a topping, a sort of a capstone layer that roofed that and seems to create a little corridor, a little hidden tunnel that you could crawl around. Anyway, I think that is the dead space that somehow neutralized the potent force of all these very well-remembered ancestral spirits, which were now living inside the citadel. Pause for a moment as you climb up the walkway beside the shaft graves and look out over the lower parts of the Mycenaean citadel. You'll see some houses down there. We believe that that's a place where warriors and scribes and other officials may have lived. Look across the valley, back toward the car park, and you will see more buildings there because they have things to do with merchants, merchandise, people bringing costly items from far away. It's been speculated that these are lodgings for foreign visitors, whether they were traders or diplomats from monarchs far away. This was where they were housed rather than in the citadel itself. Go up to the place where suddenly there's a switchback, hard to your right, and you will be at the gate of the palace. You can see the two doorposts still there and the step up that takes you from this outer world of the citadel into the royal family's own quarters. You will now see a rather confusing jumble of rooms as you continue to follow the modern touristic route, which puts you above and inside those rooms in terms of the whole structure of the hill, with views out over the now roofless royal quarters to the vast plain of Argos, which lies beyond, and even a little glimpse of the sea. Remember, this is why the site was chosen, because it commanded this view and it commanded the route from the sea over the hills and on north to Corinth and the Isthmus of Corinth and northern Greece. The big moment is coming for you. We are about to be able to look into, as a dear friend of mine likes to say, the room where the Trojan War was planned, the king's own hall, the true megaron, a place that had a sort of entry court to it, framing a doorway, a big circular hearth where there would have been glowing embers throughout the year, and then either straight ahead or to one side, the throne of the king of Mycenae. And at the time of the Trojan War, let's say around 1200 BC, that king probably was someone named Agamemnon. There's no reason to believe that Homer's hero was not a historical monarch. I can remember walking up that path one day with a group of my own students, and I heard ahead of me a sonorous voice with a Greek accent saying in English, "You are now standing in the room where the Trojan War was planned." I said, "That sounds like Michael Cosmopoulos." And indeed, that great young archaeologist was there, christening that room in my memory with its most memorable designation. Surely it was the original smoke-filled room where the power brokers of the Mycenaean world came together and with the king of Mycenae planned that epic assault on Troy all the way across on the other side of the Aegean Sea. The most gigantic undertaking that they ever took as a joint body following their one sole king. Homer, as I said, describes how they liked beef when they were all together. And indeed, these were feasting halls. Feasting halls, that seems like a wonderful thing. You come and get a free dinner, but just as there is no free lunch in our world, there's no free dinner in the Bronze Age world. By the act of accepting a feast from the king in that megaron, in that hall around his big circular fire, you are showing yourself to be like a child or a dependent on him. He is your father. We might think your godfather. Someone who now can command your loyalty and who assumes you are a faithful companion and part of his company. Thousands must have done it over the course of the years when Mycenae was the power hub of Bronze Age Greece. I always pictured big carcasses of cattle roasting over open flames as in a medieval castle. But an interesting discovery made in this part of the palace shows us that's not how they did it. If you go to any Greek taverna today, you can order something called souvlaki. The Turkish name for that is shish kebab, but it's the same dish. You take a little skewer of wood with a pointed end, and on it you shove chunks of meat alternating with vegetables, and then you put it on a little rack over the charcoal fire, and you just turn it, one or two of those for each person. Exactly that, a rack for creating souvlaki, or shish kebab, was found at Mycenae, 3,000 years old, but looking as modern and ready to be used as can be imagined. It's a little tray made of clay on 4 legs, and around it on 3 sides is a rim, and in that rim were the indentations to hold the souvlaki spits of wood so they could be suspended just above those red-hot coals and turned by the maidservants. So everybody got their beef, and I'm sure there were no fooling around with vegetable habits in Mycenae at that time. Their little skewers of beef brought to them, dripping, sizzling, perfectly cooked. Truly a feast fit for a king. As we come over the top of the hill, the glories begin to drop behind us. We are now in the working part of the citadel. A king needed to have many artists at his command. He is covered in status symbols of gold, of ivory, the pommels for his swords, the treasures for his funeral. All these things need to be made on site. And so we imagine that there was a large area of artisans, workers in this area, creating the status symbols for the king, which he will also give away as gifts to visitors from abroad who have come to him, or to companions who will then go out into the world loyal to him and showing off in the gifts they have received from him just how mighty is the king of Mycenae. In the far end, we come down into a lower courtyard, a far courtyard. You'll see the postern gate of Mycenae, the rise of the mountains behind us, beyond which lie Corinth and northern Greece. And you'll also see a little doorway in the stone wall of the perimeter fortifications. That leads to a mystical staircase. 99 stone steps leading down through the darkness to a little pool, sometimes called a cistern. In fact, in the last phase of this great Bronze Age palace, before the Bronze Age kingdoms collapsed, during that last period when this glorious royal life was going on, they were under assault. We don't know by whom. There are different myths, different stories, different pieces of archaeological evidence, but at any rate, this Bronze Age tradition, which has lasted for so many centuries, the tradition of the warrior kings and their citadels and palaces, it's going to be swept away completely. The literacy, the writing in what we call Linear B Mycenaean script, that will be forgotten. The international trade lines will be broken. The populations will flee away. The great royal centers will be mostly abandoned. We can see signs of the preparation for this in what happened beyond that door. The last kings of Mycenae created a water source in the perimeter wall of their fortress. You feel like you're actually going down into a natural cave. You are not. You are going down to this little basin into which pipes had been brought from springs outside the citadel, hidden springs, so that even under siege, there would be a water supply for those inside. That's the end of your tour of Mycenae, but there's much more to see. Because beyond the citadel of Mycenae, as you retrace your steps and go back out the Lion Gate, the only way in and out, you come to the wonderful archaeological museum. Before you get too enthused by most of the gold objects in the museum, remember, these are replicas. The real gold things that came out of those shaft graves and elsewhere in Mycenae, they're in the Archaeological Museum, the National Archaeological Museum at Athens, in the special Mycenaean Hall, which many would agree is not just the centerpiece, but the true glory of that museum. But go ahead, get excited. You've never seen such swords, such emblems of royal power in all your life, not even, in my humble opinion, in the Tower of London for the kings of England. And then as you go through room after room, you will get the most wonderful impression, not just of the royal power and majesty of the kings of Mycenae, not just of frescoes that show us the beautiful women of the time in their typical flounced skirts of the Bronze Age. These are, of course, votaries of the mother goddess herself, in their own minds, probably in the minds of everyone in that culture, just as powerful in their way as the king himself. All of this in the museum, but at the same time, all these ordinary, homely bits and pieces that make up the ordinary daily life of these Bronze Age people who saw, for a moment, the whole Greek world, from the island of Ithaca in the west to the island of Rhodes in the east, from Pylos and the other cities in the south, all the way up to the Gulf of Volos in the north, where Achilles came from, all united, all brought together under one king. And it's time now to end our visit by looking at the tombs. Schliemann was wrong, the shaft tombs belong to an earlier dynasty. By looking at the tombs in which were placed the kings and queens of this last flourishing dynasty that ruled Mycenae. These, of course, are the people that Homer wrote about in the Iliad, Agamemnon and his family. And their tombs are in that tholos, T-H-O-L-O-S, a circular structure, dotted around the landscape, close up to the walls of Mycenae, or on the other side of the little hollow that you came up for that first dazzling view of the site. There are all of these tholos tombs, plural is tholoi. Some of them have lost their tops, their little igloo-like domes of stone, corbelled domes where the stones just lean in till they can put a capstone on top. And that actually is very good. There's one near the museum. Go in it. It helps you understand the structure of the site. We're only going to really focus on one. Get back in your vehicle, go down that approach road toward civilization again, and pull off to the right and join the line of people going up to what is called the Treasury of Atreus. That was the ancient name for it, Thesauros. Our word thesauros, for a treasury of definitions and quotations and synonyms, was the ancient word for a treasure house. And that probably shows us how much gold treasure came out of it. It was thoroughly looted and completely empty by the time visitors began to come in the 19th century and leave records of it. At any rate, look up the dromos, or runway, that leads between high stone walls to the door of that tomb. You are looking at the final resting place of one of the great kings of Mycenae. Dates established now by archaeologists put it about 1250 BC. That's too early for Agamemnon, but perhaps the ancient tradition was right to assign it to Agamemnon's father, the great king Atreus. March up that processional way. Priests would have preceded you back in the Bronze Age, bringing repeated offerings to the king there in his tomb. Look up at the gigantic lintel stone. We've lost forever what carved triangular stone fitted into the relieving arch above the lintel on top of the door. But inside, you are in a place at which we can only marvel. A vast dome of stone, courses of corbelled masonry converging to a capstone far above your head, and a little inner burial chamber off to your right. But after you've admired and taken in the special atmosphere of this dark, shadowy place, come back out the dromos, go to its end, and take a hard turn up the hill. It's not easy climbing, but it's worth it to scramble to the top and stand above the dome, not only appreciating that the whole vast tholos is a sleight of hand, not back in the hillside like a cave, but a freestanding stone structure covered in earth by the Mycenaeans themselves to make it look like part of the hillside. And then look up, look across the valley to Mycenae itself, the citadel from which those great kings came to their last resting places in these tholoi, and marvel anew, as I do with every visit to Mycenae, at the power and glory of those long-lost dynasties who raised the Bronze Age of Greece to its very highest pinnacle.